Hello, everybody. Why does Iran, which is not an Arab country and therefore not part of the Arab-Israeli conflict, and does not share a border with Israel, in addition to being 1,000 miles or more away distant from Israel, why is Iran Israel's greatest enemy today? Well, you don't have to look for any answer beyond one word: Islam. That's why. And today we're going to talk about Islamic replacement theology, or Islam's replacement theology. This is the third volume or episode in the series Making Sense of the End Times. Now, to recall, the last episode was about the church's replacement theology, and I'm arguing in these episodes that you can't begin to understand the end times before we examine the replacement theologies of Christianity and Islam. Now, I said in the last video that the topic of church replacement theology is so vast that a single video certainly does not do justice to the topic. In fact, I said I could probably teach a whole semester on the topic of church replacement theology alone. But I did touch at least on the surface of the topic, and I chose to focus in the last episode on how the church reads itself into the New Testament intra-Jewish dispute between Jewish believers of Jesus and Jewish rejectors of Jesus. Remember that I mentioned in the last episode that the major conflicts within the New Testament, up until at least the book of Acts, has to do with Jews versus Jews. Jews that accept Jesus, Jews that are against Jesus. But starting in the 2nd century, when Christianity now becomes a Gentile religion in its own right, or at least the process of it becoming a Gentile religion in its own right is well on its way, the Gentile church begins to read itself back into the New Testament vitriolic dispute between those Jewish believers in Jesus versus the non-believers in Jesus, by reading itself into the role of those Jewish believers in Jesus. And therefore, the church begins to see the Jewish opposition against their fellow Jews who believe in Jesus as rather a dispute between Jews who reject Jesus and Christians, i.e., at least from the 2nd century onward, Gentiles. It becomes a Jewish-Gentile dispute, a vitriolic dispute that would go on, unfortunately, to define Christian-Jewish relations for the next 18 to 1900 years. And before we delve into Islam's version of replacement theology, I just wanted to mention one more thing about the church's own replacement theology, because it's very pertinent to today's subject. The church historically does not just read itself into the New Testament or project itself into the Jewish disputes or intra-Jewish dispute of the New Testament. The church also reads itself into the Old Testament. In fact, the very name Old Testament is subtly one of replacement theology. But I'm going to leave that for another video altogether. What I'm really referring to is this: the church historically reads itself into the story, or let's say the unfolding story of Israel's history in the Old Testament, by looking at the Old Testament not so much as the history of Israel, but rather the history of the church, wherein Abraham and Moses and all the Old Testament believers or followers of Yahweh, the God of the Bible, they're not looked on so much as Jews as much as the church. These are pre-incarnation of Jesus Christians. In other words, according to church replacement theology, all the heroes of the Old Testament, including King David and others, they were really pre-New Testament Christians. They may have been Jews incidentally or circumstantially, but the church historically sees the Old Testament as the history of the nascent or early church, or the pre-incarnation of Jesus church, which is later augmented by the New Testament church. Now, of course, I as a Jew, and most Jews would totally reject that. And I would say rather, no, the Old Testament is the history of Israel, the history of the Jews, and New Testament Christians, according to Paul in Romans chapters 9 through 11, are grafted in to that community of Jewish believers. But as far as people like me go, we don't see, or I don't see the birth of the church until the New Testament. Okay, so here an example again of church replacement theology, reading the church into the Old Testament to the point where it insists on all the Old Testament saints, because that's usually what they're called in Christian circles, being Christians actually, okay? Christians thousands of years before the incarnation of Jesus here on earth in the New Testament, rather than Jews, which Christianity acknowledges they were circumstantially, okay? But it's not the main story. The main story is the church history starting with these Old Testament saints. Now, the reason why I brought this up is because now you'll understand that that's not so radically different from Islam's replacement theology. I call Islam's replacement theology the ultimate replacement theology. For Muslims believe that these Old Testament figures, or Old Testament saints, as they would be termed by Christians, Abraham and even Noah, Adam, okay, because Adam's considered a prophet according to Islam, Solomon, David, all of these people were Muslims, not even Jews, and certainly not even Christians. Now, of course, you may ask, Steve, how is this possible, considering that Islam didn't rise until the 7th century AD, hundreds of years after the New Testament, and thousands of years after the birth of the Jewish nation as a people? How in the world could the Muslims believe that Abraham, Noah, Adam, Eve, David, Solomon, all those people were Muslims? Well, the answer is very simple. Because Islam believes that the true religion that was revealed to these Old Testament saints was always Islam. In fact, the original scriptures were the Quran. They may not have been called the Quran back then, but they would have been identical or nearly identical to what became the Quran. But you see, according to Islam's replacement theology, the Jews and Christians perverted the Holy Scriptures, perverted the text. The Bible is the finished product of that Jewish Christian perversion of the text. And Muhammad was given the Quran by the angel Gabriel to correct this Jewish and Christian perversion of the Scriptures, to restore the Scriptures to their original substance or to their original text. And therefore, according to Islam, all these previous believers in Judaism and Christianity were in fact Muslims and only became practitioners of Judaism and Christianity as part of this grand perversion of the Scriptures by both these groups, the Jews and the Christians. So, similar to reading Christians into the Old Testament text, Islam not only reads Islam and Muslims into those earlier texts, but claims that the Bible itself is a forgery, both its Old and New Testaments, and that the Quran came to restore the Scriptures to their original form, that the Quran is the original text. It may come in its latest version chronologically after the Jews and Christians, the Old and New Testaments, but what Islam claims is that the Quran that was dictated to Muhammad by way of the angel Gabriel during the famous month of Ramadan, well, that was always the Scripture. This was just God's way, or Allah restoring the Scriptures to their pre-Jewish and Christian doctoring of the text. And that, therefore, is the ultimate replacement theology. And this replacement theology has layers added to it over the last couple centuries, especially in the last 100 years since Israel's creation. Let me give you an example. Back in the 1930s and 1940s, before the State of Israel, the Waqf, which is the name of the Islamic Trust of the Temple Mount. That's the name of it to this day. Okay, today it's operated out of Jordan, that Islamic Trust, again called the Waqf. But back in the 30s and 40s, it was based in Jerusalem, and they published a book, a tour book for tourists that came from abroad in English concerning the sites of the Temple Mount. And in this brochure or tour book, Islam states, or the Waqf states, that the main original source of holiness for Jerusalem's Temple Mount was Solomon's temple. There was no attempt to hide this. But in the ensuing decades, with the rise of Israel and the Temple Mount becoming now one of the main disputes between the two religions, Islam would go on to totally change its view of history and say that there was never a Jewish temple on the Temple Mount. In fact, Solomon built what's called the Dome of the Rock on today's Temple Mount. Now, we know that the Dome of the Rock was built sometime around 691 and 692 by the Caliph known as Abdel Malik. That's known as a fact in secular history and archaeology, but in the popular Islam of today's Middle East, that's not the case at all. Solomon, the King Solomon, was a Muslim, and he's the one that built today's Dome of the Rock on the Temple Mount, not the Jews. The Jews never had a temple, says Islam. Okay, so you see how Islam's replacement theology has added even layers in the last few decades to a religion that is all about replacement theology to begin with. Whereas Christianity historically would argue that the Christians have replaced the Jews as God's chosen people, Islam argues that the Muslim Ummah, or congregation, has replaced both the Jews and the Christians. And of course, the Quran replaces that perverted scriptures called the Old and New Testaments, or the Bible. Now, Islam came up with a regime of rules by which Jews and Christians that live in Islamic countries were reminded of their replaced status within Islam. Islam refers to the Jews and Christians by two titles, the first being Ahl al-Kitab in Arabic, which means peoples of the book. In other words, Islam does acknowledge that God used Jews and Christians in the past as vehicles or mediums of his revelations to the world. They're just guilty of perverting those scriptures, but they were one time used by God as part of his ongoing revelation to humanity, and therefore they've earned this special status within Islam called Ahl al-Kitab, peoples of the book, and therefore they're worthy of a second title or a corollary status called Ahl al-Dhimma in Arabic, which means protected peoples. What this means is that according to Islam, neither Jews or Christians are to be murdered for not converting to Islam, which unfortunately is what happens to those that are neither Jews or Christians whose territory Islam conquers. But as it relates to the Jews and Christians, they're not to be murdered, but we're to be subjugated to Islam and its community, and we're to be reminded of our subjugation by several laws that have been enacted to remind us of our second-class status. Now, one of those laws is that in Islamic countries, Jews and Christians are not allowed to build new churches or new synagogues that are post-dated to Islam. In other words, any church or synagogue that exists in an Islamic-run country or society today is a leftover from those days preceding Muhammad. But according to Sharia law and to these laws relegating the status of Jews and Christians, no new church or synagogues are allowed to be built since those countries became Muslim. Likewise, at least Jews had to wear at some times and some places clothing or articles of clothing that separated them and identified them as Jews. Now, you may recall the Nazis ordering their Jewish communities under their rule preceding the Holocaust to have to wear these gold stars of David on their lapels or on their clothing that said Jude, okay, Jude in German being Jew, okay, so that regardless of how that Jewish person looked physically or ethnically, they would be more easily identified by that yellow star they had to wear. Well, believe it or not, that began in the Islamic world centuries ago. There were some places within the Islamic world where Jews were forced to wear different articles of clothes or special hats that they would wear to physically identify them from the Arabs or Muslims living in those societies. So that was also part of these rules that I'm referring to. Likewise, Jews and Christians were not allowed in the days preceding the invention of the automobile to ride horses, but rather they were forced to ride donkeys only, for horses were purely the privilege of the Muslims, okay? Because a horse is considered a noble animal, and Jews and Christians are less than noble, okay? And would only be allowed to ride basically jackasses or donkeys. So again, another rule to remind the Jews and Christians of their inferior status. Now, you can't understand the end times and the Muslim angst towards Israel without understanding what I've just explained in the last few minutes. For when Israel was born in 1948, this was a shock to Islam. For these second-class citizens, these barely tolerated people, the Jews, tolerated enough that they're not to be killed, but looked down upon with such disdain as the inferior to Muslims. When Israel became a state in 1948 and defeated them in the War of Israel's Birth, the Independence War, this was a shock to the Muslims. And they refer to it in Arabic as the Nakba, the calamity or catastrophe. Not just because many of the Arabs that lived in what became Israel were either fled or kicked out of their homes, but also because of the shame that this was said to have brought upon Islam, that the Jews conquered a territory in the heart of Dar al-Islam, the abode of Islam. Anywhere where Islam is conquered in the world, including Spain, including Sicily, okay, including parts of Europe, is forever regarded by the Muslims by this expression that I just said, Dar al-Islam, the abode of Islam. And the Jews conquering part of the heart of that territory, Dar al-Islam, and establishing a state in the midst of the Islamic world, in the heart of that Islamic world. My gosh, this is considered the ultimate shock and shame to Islam. But how much more so in 1967, when these disdained, barely tolerated Jews won the war known as the Six-Day War, humiliated Islam, which regards its success as a religion by its success on the battlefields or the lack of success on the battlefield. Islam is a martial religion which judges its success in the favor of Allah on them based on its successes or lack thereof on the battlefield. Well, here's one of the most humiliating defeats to ever be visited upon the Muslims, actually the most humiliating defeat to ever be visited upon them, the Six-Day War, in which the Jews not only defeated the combined armies of Islam or, Muslim countries such as Egypt, Syria, Jordan, Iraq, other countries, okay, in the 1967 war, but captured the Temple Mount, the holiest site of Judaism and the third holiest site of Islam. The only real thing I can liken that to in the American experience would be if in Jim Crow states, the Jim Crow law states of the South, if suddenly the Jim Crow law regime came to an end and within a day or two the blacks, okay, or those African Americans living in those former Jim Crow states, within hours or days of that Jim Crow regime coming to an end, those same blacks suddenly taking over the states of Mississippi, Louisiana, Alabama becoming the state's governors, becoming the state's city's mayors, taking over the city councils of each of these cities. In the same way that would shock the South of those days, Israel's rebirth in 1948 and its victory in the Six-Day War of 1967 visited upon the Muslims a similar shock from which they've never recovered to this day. And that's one of the reasons why Islam is sworn to Israel's destruction, because of its version of replacement theology, which has been rattled by the rebirth of Israel in 1948 and its successes on the battlefield against the Muslims ever since. Now, in the next episode, I'm going to cover a subject that is just as important as Islam's replacement theology for making sense of the end times, and that is Islam's own eschatology. What are their beliefs about the end times and Jerusalem's role in those end times? That's going to be the next episode. Now, before I depart from you guys, I just want to thank you. Over the year, about a dozen of you supported me through a site called Patreon. Okay, I linked it to many of my videos in the description below those videos. And some of you, again, about a dozen of you, subscribe to my Patreon account, which each month provided me somewhere between $3 or $5 per person. And I want to thank you for that. This past week, I ended my relationship with Patreon because they changed their rules and their policies to the detriment of those of us that are YouTube creators. And I've chosen instead to switch to a site called Ko-fi. And what makes this site Ko-fi actually better than Patreon is that it not only allows those of you that want to bless me each month with a cup of coffee, again, for $3 or $5 or $10 or whatever. But not all of you, or not everybody, likes to be billed monthly, which is Patreon's only way of supporting people like myself. But this new site, Ko-fi, allows you to do that, but it also allows you to just give a one-time gift or blessing without being billed or without it recurring each month. And I just wanted to alert you to that. So if any of you want to bless Steve the tour guide with a cup of coffee, visit the link below, Ko-fi, and you can do it on a monthly basis or you can do it in a one-time gifting. Anyway, again, I thank you for your generosity, for those of you that supported me through Patreon over the last year, and I thank you for your forthcoming generosity for those of you that visit that site, that link, Ko-fi, and bless me as you wish. Anyway, this is Steve the Tour Guide signing off. See you in the next episode. Bye-bye.